So here's a question for you. How good of a race car was the Shelby Cobra? Now I'm talking about the original small block roadster with leaf spring suspension. In 1963 and 64, the Cobra basically dominated SCCA A-production sports car racing. But how good was it really? Did it win because it was an epic car, or did it win because it didn't have much competition?
Raceway.
Up until 1962, SCCA production sports car racing had been dominated by the Corvette, even though Chevrolet themselves weren't that interested in racing. The Ford Motor Company was interested, and it helped Carroll Shelby to homologate and build the Cobra specifically to beat the Corvette.
My name's Carroll Shelby, and performance is my business.
The Cobra was homologated in October 1962, firstly with a 260 motor and then with a 289. And the C2 Corvette was also homologated in October 1962. The Vette had a bigger motor at 327 cubes, and it also had more power, and it had a way better and more modern suspension design. You see, the Cobra was based on a rickety English trinket called an AC Ace, and it had a suspension design that dated back to 1939. But the Corvette was heavier, like way heavier. The Cobra was homologated at 1,907 pounds. But the Corvette was 800 pounds more at a chunky 2,700 pounds. The Corvette also had drum brakes all round, whereas the Cobra had discs. So when you combine all the bits, the Cobra was just a much better race car. On debut at Riverside in October 1962, the Cobra blitzed all the Corvettes, and the writing was already on the wall. The Corvette was going to get smoked. So it proved to be. But history could have been quite different if Zora Arkus-Duntov, the father of the Corvette, had got his way. You see, he and his small team had been developing a special lightweight version of the C2 Stingray, and it was called the Grand Sport. Now the goal was to make the Grand Sport as light as possible because weight was the Corvette's biggest problem. They created a whole new tube frame chassis designed to carry a special body made from super thin lightweight fiberglass. Even the side and rear windows were made of plastic. It was a bare bones, proper race car. Now the homologation form sent to the FIA for the Grand Sport reportedly had its weight at 1,908 pounds. Now the plan was to run an alloy block 377 cube small block which showed 550 horsepower on the dyno. It was going to be quite a car, and all Chevrolet had to do was build it. But therein lay the problem. You see, the Grand Sport needed to be homologated with the FIA to compete in international competition as a GT car and an SCCA competition as an A-production sports car. And to achieve that, 100 cars had to be built in a 12-month period. But General Motors had a strict no-racing policy in place, and when the top execs found out about the Grand Sport, they shut the program down. At that stage, 5 prototypes had been built. Now Arkus-Duntov had big plans for the Grand Sport. He actually wanted to take it to Le Mans in 1963, but obviously that didn't happen. But he still didn't give up. In 1963 he'd loaned 2 of the cars to Dick Doan and Grady Davis to take away and quietly campaign and develop. Doan had chassis 3 and Davis had chassis 4. Both cars were fitted with small block 327s. And because the Grand Sport hadn't actually been homologated, they both had to run in C-modified sports car racing. And then in late 1963, Arkus-Duntov had 3 of the Grand Sports prepared for the Nassau Speed Weeks in the Bahamas. The chassis 3 and 4 were joined by chassis 5 and they're all completely rebuilt. They were fitted with big vented hood scoops, wide fender flares and Hallebrand wheels among other parts. And they were also finally fitted with the alloy block 377 motors. And then all 3 cars were painted light metallic blue and they were sent to John Meekham's workshop where the final prep was done. And Meekham also took them to Nassau. And Nassau Speed Week didn't actually use SCCA regulations, so the Grand Sports could finally compete against the Cobras. And you know what? They blew them away. Now, enthused by this, Arkus-Duntov then had chassis 1 and 2 modified as roadsters. They basically lopped the roofs off, and they prepped them for the 1964 Daytona 24 Hours. But then, of course, the GM execs heard about this, and so they scuppered his plans and they told him to get rid of all 5 cars. Now, Jim Hall of Chaparral Cars bought one of the coupes and the other 2 were bought by John Meekham, who then sold one of them to Delmo Johnson. And then all 3 entered the 1964 Sebring 12 Hours, but they had to enter the prototype class. Jim Hall shared his Grand Sport with Roger Penske and they actually qualified 7th outright. They qualified just 1 position behind the Daytona Cobra coupe, and they qualified 2 seconds faster than the fastest Cobra Roadster, which by the way was one of the Shelby American factory cars.
Surtees moves into the lead through Webster, Penske second. It's Surtees and Penske on the back straight. Look at Penske move. Penske's Corvette is by Surtees' Ferrari through the timer stand turn, and the young automobile executive takes the lead as they complete the first lap.
So in a way it's kind of sad really. If GM had committed to the Grand Sport and built it in the required numbers, they might have just changed history. But they didn't, and so they didn't. But to be fair to General Motors, building 100 Grand Sports would have actually been a pretty tall order. You see, most Shelby Cobras were actually street cars. There weren't actually that many turnkey race cars. And that's because it's really hard to sell race cars in large numbers. If you went to an SCCA race in 1964, there weren't 100 Cobras all racing around. There were usually only 2 or 3. Remember the 1965 Shelby GT350? Well, this too was homologated as a sports car, and Shelby American actually built over 500 of them. But there were 2 different models of the Shelby GT350. There was a dedicated street car and a dedicated race car. And from a total production run of 562, only 36 of these were R-model race cars. You see, the Grand Sport was a really uncompromising race car, and making a street version of this would have been incredibly difficult. You can guarantee Chevrolet would not have sold 100 race cars. And then there was the cost. Arkus-Duntov was trying to cap each car at $10,000. And that's when you could buy a brand new C2 Stingray for $4,000. So the whole project would have cost GM at least $1 million, and then they'd be stuck with a whole bunch of unsold race cars. And what could they hope to get out of it? Remember, General Motors was not in racing. So the whole thing was already dead in the water. As it was, the 5 prototypes had to be pushed out the door at knockdown prices. Apparently Jim Hall bought his one for just $5,000. The 2 Roadsters, chassis 1 and 2, ended up with Roger Penske and George Winterstein, but they didn't actually race until 1966. And then Winterstein had his on the market in early 1967, and it could have been yours for $5,500. So in 1963 and 64, as expected, the Shelby Cobra blitzed everyone in A production sports car racing, and in 64 also won the very first SCCA American Road Race of Champions. And the Corvettes, as you'd expect, were nowhere. Dick Giltran had the best placed Corvette at the 1964 American Road Race of Champions. He finished 3rd, a full lap down on the Cobras. And all this further cemented Carroll Shelby, of course, as a legend. Now at the end of the day, car companies are in the business of making money, and the bean counters usually win most of the arguments. Emotion and passion really don't feature. You know what sucks? Chevrolet built a Grand Sport edition of the C4, C6 and C7 Corvettes. So they built special celebration models of a car that they themselves refused to build. Go figure. But the good news is, even though they never got to race as intended, all 5 Corvette Grand Sport prototypes still exist. And as you'd expect, they're all now very, very valuable. And if you'd stumped up $5,500 in 1967 for George Winterstein's Roadster, and you'd held on to it, you would have done pretty well on your investment. Anyway folks, that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe and comment below. Love to hear from you. Anyway, that's it. Catch you next time. Cheers.
Through the S's for the second lap, and Penske surprising everyone. And now the Ferraris are double-teaming Penske. But Penske holds off Rodriguez and passes the start line in second place.